Now, we have been reporting all week on how tariffs are impacting various industries and businesses. And tonight we take you to different parts of the country where the trade tensions are definitely being felt. Contessa Brewer is with the Lobstermen in Northbridge, Massachusetts. Diana Olick reports on the home remodeling industry from Washington. But we begin with Jane Wells at ground zero for Chinese imports, the Port of Los Angeles.
Yeah, you know, a funny thing is happening in this trade war between U.S. and China. Companies are finding workarounds to avoid paying tariffs. How?
The Chinese factory might own a production site in Vietnam. They simply move the production from China to Vietnam. The Chinese factory still makes the profit, but the U.S. importer is not taxed because the goods are coming out of Vietnam.
Okay, let me throw out some new numbers in this trade war. According to a congressional group which monitors U.S.-China trade, during the first quarter, U.S. exports to China fell almost 20%. But check this out. At the same time, overall U.S. exports grew 0.3%. So while China's not buying as much of our stuff, somebody is.
We are starting to see some more goods coming out of Southeast Asia and the India subcon, but not nearly enough to make up for the China business.
The ports themselves, meanwhile, are doing fine. Along the Pacific, LA's container traffic is up almost 5% year to date. Oakland had its busiest April ever. That's because imports have surged, many from China, meaning tariffs are being paid, but not by China.
And Amazon incurred over $1 billion in extra cost on the last round of tariff increases. Walmart, $250 million. And so this ball just keeps on rolling and getting worse and worse for importers in terms of cost management.
But cargo that's moving on the water right now will not be impacted. So we really won't see a change for the next couple of weeks. And at that point, we'll take stock of where orders are going.
Okay, is this affecting the U.S. consumer? Well, it depends on what you buy, but overall inflation is still only 2%. What about the hit to GDP? Okay, bear with me as I show you one more number. During the first quarter, the drop in U.S. exports to China shaved this much off GDP, 0.04%. That is $6 billion. That's not nothing, but the president claims the U.S. Treasury is raking in several times that amount in tariffs. For Nightly Business Report, I'm Jane Wells at the Port of Los Angeles.
Now to Contessa Brewer in Northbridge, Massachusetts, at a company feeling trapped by tariffs.
As the steel mesh rolls off the welding machines at Riverdale Mills,
A tariff is really a fancy word for a tax.
the CEO is really feeling the heat.
When we get an invoice for steel, we pay the invoice for the steel, and then we pay the invoice for the tariff on top of it. China's not paying that.
Riverdale Mills makes more than 3,000 kinds of steel mesh products, everything from high security fencing to the mesh for oyster cages. The mesh manufactured for lobster traps goes into 85% of all those built in North America. But the lobstermen are increasingly repairing their traps rather than buying new ones. That's in part because the market for lobster in China plummeted when China slapped 25% retaliatory tariffs on American lobster.
The reason we can't pass that cost along is because we have foreign competitors that are not under the tariffs that we're under. So we have to maintain the same price that they have to compete in the global market space.
When steel tariffs went into effect March of 2018, steel prices nearly doubled. Riverdale Mills has absorbed nearly all of that cost. It has applied for exemptions from the tariffs, but of those granted, it only applies to roughly 3% of its steel purchases. In the meantime, to keep its profit margin steady, it has tried to find cost efficiencies in other areas, including reducing its workforce by 25%.
I understand the intent of the policy, but that policy hasn't helped us. It's actually hurt us from a competitive standpoint.
Another round of tariff hikes, more threats from China for retaliation. And these U.S. manufacturers say navigating the global trade war requires nerves of steel. For Nightly Business Report, Contessa Brewer, Northbridge, Massachusetts.
Our next stop, Washington, and Diana Olick.
Are you looking to remodel your home? You might want to take another look at your budget because the costs are suddenly going up thanks to higher tariffs on Chinese goods. From tile to countertops, laminates to lighting, all those fancy finishings, about 450 of them, are on the list that just went from 10% tariffs to 25%. That represents a $2.5 billion cost increase.
At the end of the day, yes, pretty much every kitchen and bath remodel, the price is going to increase.
Case says there is simply no way his business can absorb those costs and still survive.
It's probably a 7-8% increase, net increase to the consumer. And I'd love to be able to eat some of that or, help with the consumer and not just pass it along, but at this point, I don't know a way to engineer around that, to use different products that aren't affected or anything like that.
Builders were already struggling with a labor shortage, which also cost them more, and that is also getting worse. Nearly 3 out of 4 remodelers this year reported higher prices for customers due to higher costs for labor, according to a new survey from the National Association of Home Builders. Higher costs for labor and materials have some consumers reconsidering their renovations. Case said the size of the average project went way down last year as consumers tried to cut the budget.
And that's my concern for this industry, is because we're going to price ourselves out of the market.
A real concern that hits home. For Nightly Business Report, I'm Diana Olick in Washington.